Okay, good afternoon. My name is Maria Barnes, and I'm the president of the Access Lunchtime virtual user group. Today we are going to talk about empowering access forms with code. And there's a real informal group. It looks like we only have a couple attendees on at the moment, although we are recording this session, and some people do view the sessions afterwards. But please feel free to jump in during the presentation with questions. I'd be happy to meet you and talk about who you are and what kind of access user you are as well. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today we're going to talk about empowering access forms with code. I am going to show how to do these things both with VBA code and with macros. The difference between when to use what depends upon what platform you're using. If you are using Access web apps, then you do need to absolutely use macros. VBA code is not available for Access web apps. If you are using a desktop access system or writing a desktop access program, then you have the option of whether or not you want to use macros or VBA. And of course, if you do it in macros, then your database is more easily ported to a web app because the logic is already in the macros. And so I picked today three different reasons why I think it would be the most powerful and commonly used reasons to use code. And there are, of course, many others. If you have specific ones, please let me know, and we might cover those. I don't know that it would allow to cover those today, although I do have one other example prepped if we have extra time. But if we don't do it today, we could do this in a follow-up session for next month or a couple months from now. The three that I have picked out to go over today is how to validate fields, how to show or hide fields on a form, and how to open another form. And the program that I'm going to base my examples on, I wanted to just show you quickly so that you can get an idea of what the actual program looks like. I am going to end up using a kind of simplified copy of some of these forms in order to more easily show you the examples. But this is the actual program with some test data. And I thought it would be beneficial to just take a quick look at it first, and then because it looks prettier than the examples I'm going to show you. So this particular Access database is used for a plastics company. One of the things they do is develop molds for their plastics, and those molds have different specifications, and then those molds are ultimately used to produce actual plastic pieces for production. So the molds itself they call tools. This is thus called a tool tracking system. When they're developing their molds, there's several different departments that the tool has to go through. Starts in customer service and proceeds through engineering, scheduling, a sampling section, QA, then there's some optional sections. And if you see down at the, let's see, like down here towards the bottom, this value-added operation is used in some cases and not in others. So sometimes value-added here, like you see here, is done, and sometimes that's skipped depending upon the type, and they move right to dimensional. The coloring that you see on here is just done using conditional formatting, not through code. Then in order to do things like double-click on one of these lines, which this is just kind of like a dashboard that management or anybody might view. But if you were actually going to take something from one status here, like it's in process in this status, and you're going to move it on to the next department, then you would double-click to open a form, and the information at the top here is edited by the customer service department. The other departments can't edit the top section, but they can, depending upon which department they are in. If it's in their department, then they can fill in the date out with like today's date. And when they do that, it then, sorry, some of the stuff is opening on my other monitor, opens a form that allows them to go on to the next step here in the process, or to go backwards if there's something wrong and send, an email back, say, to engineering, and you would send it to a certain person, and then you might add notes in here, I'm sending this back to you to do whatever adjustment you need to do. And then that marks that as out of that particular department, and then moves it back into the department where it's supposed to go. And, in most cases it advances on to the right and doesn't go backwards, but they are allowed to do that. So that is the tool that this is based on, or the program that this is based on. Simplified, we are going to cover first the validation part of it. For validation, if you can see in the details here, I think I actually did this in this case, in this example, sorry, right here in the tool tracking. Oh, that's open. Okay, I did do the before update on tool tracking. So if you're going to validate the data entered in a form, then the place to do that, as far as the event to put the check code in, is in the before update event. And the reason you want to do it in the before update instead of the after update is because if there's something wrong with the validation, if something turns out to be, not correct, then you want to cancel the update. And usually I recommend going to the particular form or setting focus to the particular field on the form that is in error. So here in the before update, if we look at this macro, this is checking two things. One, to see if the mold number field is blank, and one to check to see if the category field is blank, because the rules in this case are that you have to enter a mold number and a category. So this is the macro to do both of those things. And it's fairly simple here. There's an if statement, and the if statement uses the null zero function to coalesce with just an empty string. So if you've either not entered anything at all ever in there, or if you've entered a blank string, then it pops up here with the message box that says you must enter a mold number, and then it cancels the event, which is the update event, and goes to the control named mold number. And so then if it were to pass this test, then it would do the next validation check and then go to the category control. So that is the macro. And then in order to show you the code behind it, I already have this written, so it's already just going to go to here. The code, as you can see, is very similar to that. The methods are called more directly in VBA code. So for instance, the message box isn't a 4-line item, but it is only a 1-line call. And then here is the set focus command for the mold number. And in this case, I've actually added and I could have done this in the macro as well, but once it has the first item, it does a go-to statement down to this area of the routine, and that is where the cancel event, which is part of the form update event, is set to true. And so it wouldn't go and look at the second item. It just stops at the first item. And I could have done something similar in the macro. I did not for simplicity's sake. But both of these do the same thing. Then the next thing to show is to make things visible and invisible. And that we are doing here in this change department. What we want to do is if the particular department coming in is the shipped, it is the category shipping or department number 9, which is shipping, then we want to keep this checkbox visible. Otherwise, we want to make that checkbox invisible. So in this case, I'm going to attach the code to the onOpen event of the form. That way, as soon as we come in here, we are going to go ahead and check to see what the value of the department we're calling from is and decide whether to make this field visible or invisible. As a macro, that looks like this. First of all, because the fields that I'm looking at come from another form, we've popped up to this form, I'm going to set some temporary variables here that I'm going to look at. It just makes it easier. I could have directly used these particular values in my checks, but I am not going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and set temporary variables to make it a little more readable. So here we test then to see if the temporary variables equals 9, which is our shipping department. And if it does, then we're going to set the property of the control name check shipped, which is that checkbox, to the visible property, and we're going to set it to 1. Now you'll notice when we look at the VBA code that syntax for that is a little bit different. For VBA code, you would want to set the visible property to true as opposed to 1, but 1 is ultimately what that true ends up computing as. So if it's not Department 9, then we are going to go in here and set the visible property of check shipped to false. And actually this should be 0, not false, sorry. And then the value property of check shipped to 0. And that's done just as a precautionary, because otherwise, if it's invisible, we haven't set it to anything, and the default is probably unset or 0, but that's just kind of an extra double check. And in this case, then we're also doing something else in this macro, and that's computing this value of our next step property. That has nothing to do with setting that to be visible or invisible, but it is part of what needs to work for this particular form. So I'll go ahead and show that here. I should have probably done that with the other one here. Start with this, and let's go to one that is in tell what category those are in. I do not remember. I think, yep, this one is in the shipping process right here. So if we change that date here to today, and then take a look, this shipped items is checked, or showing rather. It's not checked because the user actually has to decide whether or not they want that they have shipped the items. It's, in this case, if they're sending it backwards, they're not shipping them out, and so they wouldn't check that box. If they're sending it forward, if they're sending it on to the next department, then they generally ship the items out, and so they check the box. And just process this through here. Oh, lovely. And let's try this other one down here, which I believe is not in the shipping department. So in this case, we are in the sample tool department, and so then we will see here that when they change that, we do not have the check shipped, or the shipping box showing for that because it's not in Department 9. And then let's look at the code for that. And again, that's going to be very similar. This one, we're not there. We're on the open event. So the code for this looks very similar. We're setting up our temporary variables here. Then we're doing a test, and if the temporary variable current department equals 9, then here's where we're using true or false instead of 1 and 0 as in the macro. And then we don't have to say .value in this case. It means the same thing just to set it. And I do a couple other things in the code here just because that it's easier to do that. There are some things you cannot do in macros, and that's a good point to bring up. The row source property is something that it's often nice to set in code. This is the row source of these drop-downs of the this drop-down and this drop-down. And I am actually setting that dependent upon which department we are already in, because each department can have, in this case, I'm using where the department is less than or equal to the current step, so or the next step, which would be one beyond it. So I can send it backwards. And in this case, without this code, I just have to use all departments as a row source, and that's not really what I want, because I don't want to be able to send it to 2 or 3 departments down the process. I really want to limit what's able to be selected. And then the send to row source, there are different people who are able to, or who are in each department, and so then you can send it to, just one particular person, maybe the person you're familiar with in that department. And so we don't have all the users' emails available if we do this. So, in this case, because we can't set the row source in a macro, I would, for this particular application, not use macros. I would use VBA definitely, even though it's not as flexible, because it has more power to do things that I need to do in this particular application. Then the third item I'd like to show you is how to open a form here from another form. And that one I'm showing last because it's just a little bit trickier. And I think I did this for the macro. Yes, just for one particular category or one particular field here. And then what I did for the other option, which is the code option, is I actually set that for the double-click event for each of the fields here. And the way I did that for the VBA is you can actually select, all of the fields. I'm going to select them all here. See if I can not unglue the macro example that I have. Select them all, and then unselect this one. Okay, so you can set this, I have all those selected, and you can set this property for all of them at once. And this open detail, you see the parentheses afterwards, is actually a function. So you can't call a subroutine like this, but you can set it equal to a function. And then I have my code actually in that function. So the function is a private function, open detail here, and then we do the actual command, which is an open form, in the function, as opposed to a subroutine like you're used to seeing from just one event. So that's a trick for doing that. Now, if I really were using macros for this and not just, giving an example of how to use that, instead of using an embedded macro, I would actually create a named macro. And that macro then I would call on all the double clicks for all of these fields on the form. And that way you don't have to create the macro multiple times. And here's the same thing, opening up a new form from the macro perspective. And you use, again, the open form property. And you call it with, or method rather, you call it with the form name, and then you can set it just like you did in the code, a where condition. And the syntax is just a little bit different here. Here I'm using the tool ID from the forms. In the VBA code, I used me.toolID as opposed to having to, use the whole form name. But there's you can't access me within macros. You have to use the form name followed by the exclamation point, or the forms object rather, followed by the explanation point, followed by the form name, and another explanation point, and then the field name in order to reference what the value is. In this case, I'm opening it in dialog mode, and again, the same thing is done in the VBA code with the parameter here for dialog. You probably have actually created macros or code yourself, even though you may not have been aware that you have done so. For example, if you go and you do in form design and you click on a button and you add a button up here and you go through the command button wizard, say you're going to do, a form operation, open a form or whatever, and choose the form you want, open it and show all the records, or find specific data. You are going to, through this command button wizard, you are actually going to be creating a macro. And it used to be, I believe this was before Access 2010, that the default was to create VBA code as opposed to macros. But now the default is to create a macro. So then you could go and look at this, and this looks very close to what we just did. It doesn't have the where condition because I didn't answer that part, and the default is normal, but you could fill those in and change those items to be just like what we looked at on our macro. You can also use some capabilities built in within Access to convert existing macros to VBA. And see if I can remember where that is. Here we go. So in this case, if you wanted to do that, if you had, for example, some macros in your forms and you knew that you wanted to use VBA instead, maybe because you wanted to extend those initial macros and do other things with them, you could use this tool. It's on the form design section, and it then is over here in the right under tools, and this routine here, or this selecting this tool item, will convert any macros in this form to Visual Basic. So if I use this then, and you have some options, including comments that are in your macros or adding error handling if you want, that will convert them. And then if you take a look here, we use this, let's see, that was command button. There we go. So this was command 33 that we had. This is the VBA code that it converts it to, and as you see, it has some error checking in here just to pop up the error message, trap it, and pop it up, which you should always use, of course, error checking in your code. So that is one option that you have if you ever want to convert from macros to VBA. And I did put that here on my slide, selecting that. You can also select that from the Macro Design tab as well as from the Form Design tab. And as far as I know, there is no tool to go backwards from that, to convert VBA to macros. The reason behind that is likely that would return many, I can't translate this directly into a macro message because of the fact that there is limited capabilities in macros, not all of them. Not all the functions that you can do in VBA can you do with macros itself. So you can't go backwards like that. Since we have a little time, I guess first of all I will ask, is there any questions that you have, anything in particular that you would like to see done in code or macros? Okay, so then I'll go ahead and we're allowed up to an hour here, and we're right at 35 minutes. Extend just a little bit longer here, and I'll show you one other place that I've got some code in here. And then that is in this Save and Send Email button. And that's, I guess, worth talking about because for the email option, there is a couple different options. For the macro itself, I am, in this case, using a command, run data macro. And the reason I'm using that is because that macro, the data macro, is the correct way to send an email from macros. So in this case, I developed the send email macro already, and that is actually attached to a table because it is a data macro. So the way to get to your data macros is, and this is not necessarily obvious at first, but because it's a data macro, it needs to be attached to a table. So to get to those macros or to create one, you actually go into Design View for the table, and then the data macros are options over here. So you can create either macros that happen after you insert a row in the table, after you update a row, after you delete a row, before you delete a row, before you change, or that's like before update. Or you can create a named macro. And if you already had a named macro attached to this, then you would see Edit Named Macro. So I must be on the wrong table here. Let me look at departments. New. There we go. I attached it to the tool tracking details. Sorry. So here I am going to look at the named macro that I created called Send Email. And that then is able to use the macro option Send Email. And here's another good time to just explain when we are looking at data macros, they have some less options here in the drop-down box than macros that are not data macros. And they have different options, things like create record and delete record, or or the lookup record. Those are only available from data macros. So you see on here we have send email as one of the options. And all it does is allow you then to put the two copy and blind copy fields in which this case I'm going to grab those from the field, the drop-down field in the change department form and put it in the subject. And I just made this example simple. In the body it just says status here. And if you were looking at a macro, like for instance, for, let's go back into, maybe I don't, I still got this one open. Yes, I still left this one. So if you're looking at a macro here and the action here, you have more options that show. And you notice that the send email is not an option here on that. That's why I needed to create a data macro to do that. In addition, besides having different types of options in macros, there is a security issue. And so you see up here in the show hide, the action catalog, that's the default. And then if you want to do things that are only available for databases that have been trusted, you have to actually click this so that it's highlighted. And then you get a few more options in here of things that you can do. However, you still don't get send email or some of the other update options that you get in data macros, but you do get a wider selection that you can use if your database is a trusted database. But again, you can't see those by default. You have to check this message or option here to unhide that. So I did want to review that, so that you could take a look at that and know about that. So here then, if we're not looking at the macro, which uses send email and really can only do something simple, we want to look at the code behind that. And in this case, for the code, I've done a couple other things. I've done some error checking at the beginning here. If check shipped is visible, you have to have checked the box or not. You can't just have the value be null. And if you also have to check or select a send to value and a next step value, who to send the notice to. And if not, it goes back and sets focus to those things. And then it actually does some updates here to change the status. And what we're doing here, this first one here, is setting the date out value on the row to the fact that the user got this completed, and then this is here with the set date out, and then this next one sets the date in for the next step department. And so that lets you know when you've transferred it from one to the other. And then there's something in here if we're actually completing it and when we're shipping it. And then this last section is what I like to use for sending an email. And this is making use of Outlook's object. And you can actually set a reference to the Outlook object, Microsoft Outlook 15.0 object library, and then you can get some data sense in some of this while you're developing. What I like to do is is check this while I'm developing and actually use Outlook or whatever I'm interfacing with objects so I get IntelliSense, and then I like to uncheck it before I release it and go in then, and instead of doing things like making the Outlook mail object here as an Outlook mail object, I just set them to objects. What that allows you to do if you uncheck the reference is not tie your code down to a specific version of Outlook. For instance, if I've got Outlook 2013 on my computer and I'm developing and my client has only Outlook 2010, then that connection or reference to the Outlook 15, what it's called inside, is broken and has to be reset to their reference. Or perhaps you have a client that uses a multitude of different versions of something, depending upon what the user is. So that's why it's nice not to tie it to that specific reference if you can. So what this does here is set this Outlook object to the existing instance of Outlook that's open on the person's computer. If it's not, notice I have an on-error resume next here. If it can't find it, then it creates it, which means essentially that it opens Outlook on the person's computer. And then I set my error trapping back to go, after I'm done with this little blurb, to go back to my actual error trapping, which is down at the bottom of the routine, so that I do trap further errors as opposed to resuming next all the time. So in this case, I'm looking up email address, and I'm using the create item of the Outlook object to create a mail item, and I set that to this mail object. And then I fill in the spots. And this part looks very similar to what you saw in the macro where we had a to. You can do a copy and a blind copy as well with this. You can do even more things in code that you can't do as easily in the macro. So in this case, I did a lookup to find the email address as opposed to just finding or setting it to a value that's on a form already, because the send to actually just has the identifier of the person, and then I look up their email address in the table. And then I'm doing things like building the subject line with some lookups into particular fields. And in this case, if you remember my email, which I think I might still have up someplace, or maybe in a draft. Let's see if I can find it. This email here is like in a table format, and that's done with the HTML here, and that is, if you're familiar with HTML, you would have to be a little familiar with HTML in order to create an actual HTML body. You can actually, or you can use the default, which is text, and just fill in text. But they wanted this to be nicely formatted, and so the table option is a great way to do that. So this is just a beginning table, and then down at the end, someplace here, there's an end table, and then each row starts with TR and ends with a /TR, and then there's multiple items within one row. Each item or cell has TD and then an ending TD after the cell. So that's the way to build that. And in this case, I build part of it, and just to make it not be so long, I add on to it. And then this last command here, the display command, actually, instead of just sending it, opens it up in Outlook so that you can then, go to this section and add your other comments. You could copy to someone else or whatever, and then hit the send button and send off your email. And then I just do a little cleanup at the end, setting those objects to nothing and closing back the form. This is the type of error handling I usually do. I usually have some kind of error where I display something that says, well, in this case, I guess I've got two kind of errors. This is an error sending at the actual email, which is what I'm trapping, I believe. Right here, where do I use? I'm not using just the error handle, I don't think, on this one. But on standard routines, I generally use something like this, where I have a description of the error, and then I have some direction about what to do, with my phone number or whatever in there, or email address, depending upon, who I'm using for this. Any further questions that you might have? With that, I think I'm going to end the meeting today. I thank you for your participation, and hope you can join us again. If you do have any other topics you would like to be covered in future meetings, please let us know. There is a form on the Access Lunchtime website where you can suggest topics, or I'm happy to take suggestions directly. We have my contact info here that you can use. Contact me here at this email or at Twitter at mbarnes@bbs. Thank you so much for joining us today.